Whispering, intense voice, over black screen with single rifle shot sound effect. They didn't charge across open fields. They didn't die in glory. They crept into the attics of innocent families, knocked holes through brick walls with their bare hands, and waited. Forensic investigators found their blood still soaked into the floorboards, 160 years later. These are the snipers of Gettysburg that history forgot to mention. And what they did, inside that house, will haunt you. The Invisible Killers of Gettysburg, a secret horror buried in blood and brick. The town before the storm. Pennsylvania, the summer of 1863. A small, quiet borough tucked between rolling green hills and farmland, Gettysburg. A place of about 2,400 souls. Carriages rattled down cobblestone streets past tidy storefronts and white-steepled churches. Children played in back gardens. Women hung laundry on lines strung between elm trees. Men read newspapers on front stoops, scanning headlines about a war that felt, to many of them, like a distant and terrible thunder growing louder with every passing week. The town's only real claims to fame were its two colleges, the Lutheran Theological Seminary perched on a ridge to the west, and Pennsylvania College sitting just north of the town center. Gettysburg was, by any measure, a sleeping little town. Unambitious. Unassuming. Peaceful. But that peace was already fracturing at its foundations. For 2 full years, the American Civil War had been grinding its way across the continent, pitting the Union states of the North against the Confederate states of the South in a conflict so savage, so ideologically raw, that entire generations would spend the rest of their lives trying to process what they had witnessed and survived. The issue of slavery, the brutal, systemic enslavement of hundreds of thousands of human beings, sat at the rotten core of this conflict. And no resolution was anywhere on the horizon. By the early summer of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had pulled off a string of staggering victories. At Fredericksburg. At Chancellorsville. The South was confident. Dangerous. And hungry. Literally hungry. Confederate supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and Lee knew that if he could push his army of Northern Virginia deep into the fertile heart of Pennsylvania, his men could live off the land. Strip the northern farms bare. Rest. Regroup. And perhaps, deliver such a punishing blow to the Union that the war-weary citizens of the North might finally demand a negotiated peace settlement. Lee crossed the Potomac on June 15, 1863, leading nearly 75,000 soldiers into the North. It was the most audacious gamble of the war. In Gettysburg, the rumors arrived before the soldiers did. Word spread from farm to farm, house to house. Confederate troops were marching through Pennsylvania. They were burning things. Stealing horses. Taking food. And they were coming this way. People began to hide their valuables. Their silver. Their horses. Their food stores. Families debated whether to stay or flee. And among those families, one made a decision that would burn itself into the history books in the most unexpected, most horrifying way imaginable. The Shriver family. George Shriver was a man with a dream. In 1860, just as the country was beginning its slow, catastrophic tear toward civil war, George had completed construction on a beautiful 4-story brick home on Baltimore Street, one of Gettysburg's main thoroughfares. It was a fine house. A proud house. The kind of house a man builds when he believes the future is still something worth building toward. But George wasn't just building a home. In the cellar of that house, he was constructing something else entirely, Shriver's Saloon and Tenpin Alley. A bowling establishment. A social gathering space. A place where the working men of Gettysburg could drink a cold beer, roll a few rounds, and forget the weight of their daily labors for a few hours. By August of 1861, the saloon and bowling alley were nearly ready to open. George Shriver was weeks away from realizing his dream. And then the war took him. George enlisted in the Union Army, Cole's Cavalry, Company C, and rode away from Baltimore Street, leaving behind his wife Hetty and their 2 small daughters, 7-year-old Sadie and 5-year-old Molly. The dream in the cellar gathered dust. The bowling pins stood silent. The bar collected no customers. Hetty Shriver was now a woman alone in a brick house on a busy street in a town that was about to become a battlefield. She managed. As so many women did during that war, managing the household, managing the fear, managing the children's questions about where their father had gone and when he was coming home. George sent letters. He came home once, for Christmas of 1863, a 4-day furlough that must have felt like an entire lifetime compressed into a handful of precious hours. But when the rumors began flooding into Gettysburg in the final days of June 1863, when the cannon fire could actually be felt as a low vibration in the floorboards, Hetty Shriver made a decision. She packed what she could carry. She took Sadie and Molly by their hands. And she fled. She had no way of knowing what she was leaving behind. No way of knowing what the walls of her home were about to witness. No way of knowing that when she walked back through her front door 6 days later, she would return to a house that had been transformed into something from a nightmare. The armies converge. July 1, 1863. Dawn. Confederate cavalry rode into Gettysburg from the west, not looking for a fight, initially. Confederate General Henry Heth had sent men toward the town based on a rumor that there were warehouses full of shoes there. His soldiers needed shoes desperately. Boots rotted. Feet bled. Men marched barefoot on gravel roads for miles. Instead of shoes, they found Union cavalry under General John Buford, a brilliant, pragmatic officer who immediately recognized that the high ground around Gettysburg was worth dying for. Buford's men stalled the Confederate advance just long enough for Union infantry to arrive and dig into the ridges and hills that ringed the town from the south. What began as a skirmish over footwear exploded, within hours, into the opening day of the largest, most catastrophic battle ever fought on American soil. The fighting on July 1st pushed into and through the town itself. Civilians who hadn't fled found themselves trapped behind shuttered windows and locked doors as regiments of men crashed through their streets in organized mayhem. Bullets punched through walls. Artillery shells tore up gardens. Men fell in doorways, on sidewalks, in front of churches. By nightfall, Union forces had been pushed back through town, falling south to the high ground of Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, a long, fishhook-shaped defensive line that General George Meade would spend the next 2 days trying to hold. Confederate forces occupied the town. And somewhere in the chaos and fog of that first terrible night, a small group of Confederate sharpshooters being the Civil War term for what we would today call snipers, moved down Baltimore Street. They stopped in front of the Shriver house. They went inside. And they climbed to the attic. The attic nest. A Civil War sharpshooter was a different breed of soldier entirely. In an era when most warfare involved lines of men standing relatively close to each other and firing in massed volleys, when individual marksmanship was almost secondary to collective fire discipline, the sharpshooter operated alone, or in small units, with a singular, cold-blooded purpose, to identify and eliminate high-value targets. Officers, artillerymen, flag-bearers, generals. The psychological effect was immense. When soldiers began dropping from unseen, unheard distances, when a man standing 50 feet from you simply fell, and no one knew where the shot had come from, morale collapsed. Men moved differently. Crouched. Flinched. Refused to expose themselves. The Confederate Army's sharpshooters at Gettysburg were particularly feared because of their tactical ingenuity. Rather than simply hiding in natural terrain features like trees and rock formations, some of them did something more calculated, more intimate, and somehow more disturbing. They moved into the civilian buildings that the retreating Union forces had left behind. The Shriver house on Baltimore Street offered something invaluable to a sniper with a view of Cemetery Hill, elevation, concealment, and a brick exterior that could absorb return fire. The sharpshooters knocked loopholes through the south-facing brick wall of the attic. They broke the bricks out with deliberate, methodical force, punching crude rectangular holes just wide enough to slide a rifle barrel through. 2 holes. 2 firing positions. Then they settled in to wait. The view from those attic loopholes was devastating in its strategic value. Cemetery Hill, where Union forces had established key artillery positions, was clearly visible. Soldiers moving along the Union lines could be observed, tracked, and targeted. The distance was well within the effective range of a skilled marksman armed with a rifled musket. And then they began to fire. Shot by shot. Methodical. Patient. The crack of a musket, the acrid bloom of black powder smoke, the careful reloading, a process that took anywhere from 30 seconds to a full minute depending on the soldier's experience level. Then a careful eye pressed back to the sight. Another target acquired. Another trigger pull. From the Union side, the fire was maddening because it was nearly invisible. A puff of smoke from a dark attic window, already dissolving before anyone could fix on it. A brick wall offering virtually no vulnerability to return fire. The snipers in that attic were, for a time, almost untouchable. But almost doesn't last forever. The kill shots that changed everything. Across the battlefield, Confederate sharpshooters positioned in another famous location were doing something even more extraordinary. Devil's Den. If you have ever seen photographs of the Gettysburg battlefield, and if you are a student of the Civil War, you absolutely have. You have almost certainly seen Devil's Den without knowing its name. It is an outcropping of enormous, haphazard boulders piled atop each other in almost deliberately Gothic arrangements, as if some geological catastrophe had scattered them there for maximum dramatic effect. Before the battle, locals believed enormous snakes lived in the crevices between the rocks. The name Devil's Den had been in use for years before a single shot was fired there. During the second day of the battle, July 2nd, Confederate sharpshooters nested among those boulders and opened fire across the valley toward the Union position on Little Round Top, a wooded hill to the east. What happened next would become one of the most debated, most analyzed episodes in Civil War military history. From a distance of approximately 550 yards, roughly a third of a mile, a Confederate sharpshooter in Devil's Den aimed uphill at a Union officer on the crest of Little Round Top. The target was Brigadier General Stephen Weed. The angle was roughly 5 degrees upward. The wind off the Pennsylvania fields was unpredictable. The rifle was almost certainly a British-made Enfield musket, a weapon with a fearsome reputation for accuracy, though one that would be tested almost to its theoretical limits at that range. The trigger was pulled. General Stephen Weed fell. As his men reacted in shock, another Union officer, Lieutenant Charles Hazlett, ran to his commander's side. He bent down. He was trying to hear Weed's final words. A second shot rang out from Devil's Den. Hazlett fell across the body of the general he had rushed to help. 2 shots. 2 generals. 1,000 yards of Pennsylvania sky between the shooter and his targets. The sniper who made those shots was never conclusively identified. He was never given a name in the history books. He became, in that moment, the embodiment of something deeply unsettling about the nature of this particular form of warfare, its impersonality, its distance, its clinical, almost mechanical execution of human beings who were trying to command and lead and protect the people under their care. Weed would die from his wound that evening. Hazlett died almost immediately after being shot. Their monument stands on Little Round Top to this day, visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year who walk past it without ever knowing the full, stomach-dropping story of how those 2 men died within seconds of each other, from a single hidden marksman hiding in a pile of rocks a half-mile away. The photograph that lied. The most famous image from Devil's Den, and one of the most famous photographs of the entire Civil War, is a picture taken on July 6, 1863, 3 days after the battle ended. Photographers Alexander Gardner and his assistant Timothy O'Sullivan arrived at Gettysburg almost before the smoke had fully cleared. Gardner was a Scottish immigrant who had studied under the legendary Matthew Brady, and he understood, with almost predatory instinct, that the images he captured on those fields would define how the world remembered this war. Near Devil's Den, Gardner found the body of a young Confederate soldier. He photographed it where it lay. Then, seeing a more dramatically compelling location, a crude stone barricade that looked exactly like a sniper's hide, he and O'Sullivan moved the body. They carried it more than 40 yards. They propped it against the rocks. They placed a rifle, not the man's actual weapon, but a prop, chosen for dramatic effect, beside him. And they photographed it again. The resulting image, captioned "Home of a Rebel Sharpshooter, Gettysburg," became one of the iconic photographs of the entire Civil War era. Published in Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war, it was seen by hundreds of thousands of people in the years following the conflict and was accepted, without question, as a genuine documentary image. It was not. For over 100 years, no one questioned Gardner's captions. Then, in the 1970s, military historian William Frasanito began a painstaking forensic analysis of Gardner's Gettysburg photographs. He compared the images to the modern battlefield terrain with extraordinary precision. He demonstrated that the body in both photographs, the original location and the staged location, was the same person. He identified the rifle as a prop. He noted that no body would have remained unburied at that location for the duration required by Gardner's account. He showed that the rifle, the kind of elaborate, specialized weapon favored by dedicated sharpshooters, would have been seized by relic hunters within hours of the battle's end. The photograph was a carefully constructed fabrication, one of the earliest examples of war photography being staged for emotional and narrative effect. The irony is devastating. The most famous image of a Gettysburg sniper was fake. Meanwhile, the real snipers, the men who climbed into Hetty Shriver's attic, who punched holes through her brick walls, who bled onto her floorboards, went almost entirely unrecorded. No portraits. No names. No famous photographs. Just blood on wood that wouldn't wash out. The forensic evidence. In 1996, more than 130 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, a couple named Dell and Nancy Gudmestad acquired the abandoned Shriver House on Baltimore Street. The building had been sitting empty, deteriorating, for nearly 30 years. What they found during the restoration process was extraordinary. Under the floorboards of the attic, workers discovered 6 Civil War-era bullets, 3 of them still loaded with black powder, unfired. There were medical supplies hidden beneath the floors. Personal items belonging to the family, letters, toys, eyeglasses, corset stays, paper dolls, jewelry, found tucked inside walls and sealed into fireplace hearths. A child's shoe, placed in the ceiling according to the 19th century superstition that hiding a shoe in a house would bring good luck to the family within it. And in the attic, in the area around those 2 crude loopholes punched through the south-facing wall, there was something else. Blood. Not a trace of blood. Not a faint stain that required specialized equipment to detect. Blood in significant quantities. Blood that had soaked into the wood grain of the floorboards deeply enough to survive 133 years of abandonment, humidity, cold Pennsylvania winters, and the general entropy of a neglected building. In 2003, the attic floor of the Shriver house was subjected to forensic testing by a CSI police detective using luminol, the same chemical compound used by modern crime scene investigators to detect blood traces invisible to the naked eye. The results were unambiguous. There was mass quantities of blood in the area where the sharpshooters had been positioned. But the forensic evidence revealed something even more disturbing. The blood had been wiped. Someone had attempted to clean it up. Not perfectly, the blood had penetrated too deeply into the wood for that, but deliberately. Intentionally. Someone had gotten on their hands and knees in that sweltering attic and tried to scrub the evidence of what had happened there. And the quantity of blood, combined with the physical patterns of the staining, suggested that more than 2 soldiers had died in that attic. Contemporary witnesses had reported seeing 2 bodies carried out. The forensic evidence suggested the true number might have been higher. Their names, like their faces, are lost to history. They climbed into a stranger's home. They punched holes through her walls. They fired their weapons across a burning city. And then, one by one, they bled out on her floor in the suffocating heat of a Pennsylvania July, with the sounds of the battle they could no longer participate in echoing through the loopholes they had made. The woman who came home. When Hetty Shriver returned to Baltimore Street 6 days after she had fled with her daughters, she found her home unrecognizable. Furniture was smashed. Food was gone. Personal belongings had been seized, destroyed, or simply scattered. Every room had been ransacked in the way that only desperate, exhausted, hungry men in the middle of a catastrophic battle can ransack a space, not with surgical efficiency, but with the chaotic thoroughness of people for whom every closed door represented either a resource or a threat. A neighbor named James Pierce confirmed what Hetty had already suspected from the state of the attic. Confederate sharpshooters had been up there. Another neighbor said he had seen 2 bodies carried out of the house. Hetty stood in her attic and looked at the loopholes in her south wall. She looked at the stained floorboards. She looked at the spent cartridge casings and the powder residue and the blood that had already darkened to near black in the summer heat. We do not know exactly what she felt in that moment. History did not record her words. But we know what she did. She began to clean. She began to rebuild. She raised her 2 daughters, Sadie and Molly, alone, because the nightmare for the Shriver family was not yet over. George Shriver, her husband, the man who had built this house and dreamed of his bowling alley in the basement, had been captured by Confederate forces in late 1863 during fighting near Brandy Station, Virginia. He was taken to Andersonville Prison in Georgia, the most notorious, most lethal prisoner of war camp in the entire Civil War. A place of such systematic horror that the commandant who ran it, Henry Wers, was the only Confederate officer executed for war crimes after the conflict ended. George Shriver died in Andersonville. He never came home. He never saw the holes in his attic wall. He never knew that Confederate soldiers, men fighting for the other side, had taken the house he built with his own hands and turned it into a killing platform. He never knew that their blood had soaked into the floors of the home where his daughters had played, where his wife had waited for him, where his bowling pins stood silent in the dark cellar below. The saloon and the 10-pin alley never opened. The dream died with George in a Georgia prison, far from the brick house on Baltimore Street that still bears the bullet holes in its exterior wall, still visible to anyone who walks past today. The psychology of the sharpshooter. To understand the horror of what happened in places like the Shriver attic and Devil's Den, you have to understand what distinguished a Civil War sharpshooter from an ordinary infantryman, and why, even among soldiers who had accepted mass death as a condition of their daily existence, the sharpshooter was viewed with particular unease. The ordinary Civil War soldier fought in the open. He stood in line, often in plain sight of the enemy, exchanging fire at relatively close range. There was something about this, something almost ritual and formalized, that soldiers on both sides understood and accepted. You could see the men trying to kill you. They could see you. The violence was mutual, immediate, and impersonal in its own specific way. The sharpshooter violated all of that. He hid. He watched. He waited. He chose his moment with calculation rather than reaction. He selected his target, often an officer, often a man who was not even actively fighting in that moment, but simply walking, gesturing, trying to issue orders, and he killed that man from a distance at which the victim had no realistic chance of identifying, locating, or responding to the threat. This felt, to many Civil War soldiers on both sides, like murder rather than warfare. The distinction is philosophically murky, certainly. All warfare involves killing, but the emotional and psychological reality of it was very real to the men experiencing it. Union soldiers who survived Devil's Den and Little Round Top spoke with unmistakable bitterness about the Confederate sharpshooters who had picked off their officers from the rocks below. Confederate soldiers captured after being found in civilian buildings as snipers were sometimes treated with extreme harshness by their captors. The men who climbed into the Shriver attic knew what they were doing was tactically valuable and strategically sound. They also knew it was a death sentence if they were discovered. The Union forces who eventually neutralized the snipers' nest did so with brutal efficiency, return fire that was not aimed at any specific target, but that simply saturated the building with enough lead to eliminate whatever threat remained inside. The sharpshooters in that attic exchanged any hope of survival for a firing position that gave them tactical leverage over a portion of the battlefield. They paid for it with everything they had. Devil's Den and the Ghost. In the 160 years since the Battle of Gettysburg ended, Devil's Den has acquired a reputation that goes well beyond its historical and military significance. It is, according to dozens of documented accounts from visitors, photographers, and paranormal investigators, one of the most actively haunted locations in the United States. The first ghost sightings in the area of Devil's Den began almost immediately after the battle. Soldiers passing through the area in the weeks and months following the fighting reported seeing figures moving among the boulders after dark, figures that did not respond to calls and could not be found upon approach. As the decades passed and the battlefield became a memorial site visited by thousands of people annually, the reports did not decrease. If anything, they multiplied. The most frequently reported apparition at Devil's Den is a specific figure, described by dozens of independent witnesses across more than a century, as a young man. Shoeless. Ragged clothing. Long, unkempt hair. A floppy-brimmed hat. He appears to point, sometimes, toward Little Round Top. He has been photographed on multiple occasions, photographs that have been examined by investigators who could find no conventional explanation for the images captured. The figure matches no known historical record. He has never been identified. He is simply there, among the rocks, appearing and disappearing, shoeless and pointing, forever, at the hill where 2 Union officers fell from shots fired at impossible range. The paranormal dimension of Gettysburg extends far beyond Devil's Den. The Farnsworth House on Baltimore Street, a building bearing hundreds of bullet holes from the battle, has a room called the Garret, sealed off completely from hotel guests, that served as a firing position for 3 Confederate snipers during the battle. The room has been the subject of so much reported paranormal activity, rattling locks, blood appearing in the adjacent bathroom, sounds of movement in an empty sealed space, that the inn's owners determined that some places simply should not be reopened. At the Jenny Wade house, where Jenny Wade, 20 years old, became the only confirmed civilian fatality of the battle when a stray bullet pierced a wooden door and struck her in the kitchen, visitors have reported hearing moaning, voices, and unexplained sounds for decades. The bullet that killed her is still lodged in the woodwork of the house. For those who dismiss such accounts, there is still something undeniably powerful about the accumulated weight of death and suffering that these few square miles contain. Over 50,000 casualties in 3 days. Over 7,000 confirmed dead. Burial parties so overwhelmed that bodies were covered where they fell, in shallow graves that were later found to have been incomplete, that men were discovered partially exposed by rain and erosion for years afterward, the last confirmed remains found as recently as 1996. Whether the ghosts of Gettysburg are spirits in any literal sense, or simply the imprint of traumatic events on the collective memory of the human beings who walked those fields, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What can be said is this: nowhere else in America does the past press so insistently against the surface of the present. The horror in the attic, revisited. Return now, one final time, to the Shriver House on Baltimore Street. To the attic. A forensic detective kneels on the wooden floor with a chemical applicator and begins to work systematically across the surface. The luminol reacts with iron compounds in old blood, producing a characteristic blue glow in darkness. As the detective works across the area near the 2 loopholes, those crude rectangular wounds punched through the south-facing wall, the floor begins to glow. It glows in patterns that tell a story. There is a primary pool, the place where a man fell and did not get up. There are drag marks, partially obliterated. There are spatter patterns consistent with a wound sustained in an upright or semi-upright position, a man shot while kneeling at the loophole, pitching sideways or backward as the bullet struck him. There are the smear marks of the attempted cleanup, someone pressing cloth or clothing against the wood, trying to absorb what could not be absorbed, trying to erase what could not be erased. The detective's report confirmed. The blood evidence was consistent with at least 2 fatalities, and potentially more. Think about that for a moment. 2 men, at minimum, died in that small attic space. They died alone, in the dark, far from any surgeon who might have helped them. They died in a stranger's house, in a stranger's city, fighting a war that would ultimately be lost. They died without being identified, without having their names recorded, without receiving proper burial or ceremony or memorial. For 133 years, their blood waited in the floorboards. It waited through Reconstruction and the Gilded Age and 2 world wars and the Korean War and Vietnam and the moon landings and the fall of the Soviet Union and the birth of the Internet. It waited through decades of the house sitting empty, its windows boarded, its rooms gathering dust and water damage and the slow collapse of neglect. And when the investigators finally came with their chemicals and their careful questions, the blood was still there. It had things to say. It still does. What the snipers left behind. George Shriver never came home. Hetty raised her daughters alone. The saloon never opened. The bowling alley never hosted a single game. The bullets found under the attic floorboards during the 1996 restoration, 6 of them, 3 still loaded with black powder, are displayed in the museum that the Shriver house has become. They are small things. Conical, lead gray, unremarkable to look at. Smaller than you expect. Each one was made to go into a human body.